Welcome to Dialogue, the interview podcast that explores the most compelling aspects of true crime, challenges the genre's tropes, and features the leading voices in crime and culture.
And very much like George Floyd didn't ask to be the poster child for the new, this new civil rights movement or those protests that happened in 2020. Gabby Petito didn't ask to be the, poster child for missing white women syndrome. She didn't ask to be part of these conversations.
That voice you heard was today's guest, Amara Cofer. She's the creator and host of the podcast Black Girl Gone. I'm starting a series on what I was calling missing white woman syndrome, a term many of us have become all too familiar with over the last couple of years. But I'm leaning towards calling it missing, murdered, and the media. As any listener of Dialogue knows, we're all about asking the big questions here. And as I set out to explore the imbalanced media coverage between white women and women of color with my guests, a different story started to emerge. The media's changing role in crime coverage and our consumer response to it. Race will still be a very big theme throughout these next few interviews, but my conversation with Amara brought a perspective into the mix that I'd been previously overlooking. You can find Amara's podcast, Black Girl Gone, and her social media handles in the show notes, so be sure to check those out. For now, let's get into the conversation and kill the small talk. Well, you're a leader in this conversation, and that's why I wanted to talk to you. And I think we're at a place where people are definitely understanding that there's a discrepancy between the coverage we see in the news and in media and in true crime storytelling between Black victims and white victims, or I should say, victims of color and from all types of marginalized communities. Before we dive into that, I'm just wondering, what do you think led up to that? Why? It's a huge question, but can you give us your thoughts on how we're at this point where it's taken so long for us to acknowledge that?
I think that it's one of those things that we as a country are having to reconcile with. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of different conversations. In 2020, we saw, the reaction to what happened to George Floyd. And that was something that the country had not seen in a very, very, very long time. And actually around the world, it had never been seen for that many people to kind of, say like, we're tired of this. We see this happening. We're recognizing it. And I think all of that is part of an evolution. I can't say that we're there, but there is definitely a movement to recognize that there are discrepancies in many areas for Black people, for people of color in this country. And, we have come a really long way in this country. We've come really far, but there are many ways in which things are kind of the same and we just talk about them differently. So I think that right now people are ready to have more uncomfortable conversations. And, we're seeing the reaction of that in, the fact that, the critical race theory debates and taking that out of schools. I just saw that there was a school that were allowing people to opt their children out of learning about Black history during Black History Month. I mean, so you can see that there's a reaction because there's also being a rise and people saying, hey, listen, we need to focus on some of these issues.
And you consider yourself a true crime enthusiast. You work of the genre before you started your podcast, Black Girl Gone. Yes. Can you talk about your journey as a podcast listener to becoming a creator?
Yeah, I watch all true crimes, I'm just, like a lot of us who like true crime, like many people looked at it as a form of, not necessarily entertainment in the way like I'm entertained by it, but like fascinated by it, like the fascination of watching what people will do to each other over money or love or, because a lot of times that's what these stories, these murders are these about. So it's fascinating to watch, you know what I mean? And I never even as a paid much attention to the underrepresentation of, people of color or Black people, because I think as a Black person in America, if we're honest, we're kind of used to just not being seen or not being represented. And so it doesn't always cross your mind like, oh, none of these stories are about Black people. It's kind of like that's pretty common. So you're more captured when you do see it. You're like, oh wow, they got a story about a Black person on this one. So you don't necessarily are consciously thinking about that all the time. So I never was like, watching true crime, like there needs to be more stories about Black women. But what happened was I, was going through this transition in my life and I wanted to do something, and I decided to start a podcast. And I was like, so what could I start a podcast about? I figured I wanted to do it about true crime, but I was like, well, what if I do it about something that people are not doing a lot, focusing on a lot, which is Black women, you know what I mean? Women of color. And it kind of really it just started as an idea. I didn't know if anybody cared. I didn't know if anybody would listen. I kind of just was like, I'm going to do this. I'll see how it goes. If it works for a couple of months, it works. If not, then I'll probably, move on. But almost immediately the response to the podcast was overwhelming. And I realized, I was like, oh, okay. So there's a void here, and there are people that want to the people that want to know. And then outside of the, true crime kind of entertainment aspect of it, by the time I put out 3 episodes on my premiere day, which was March 15th. By the time I got to by the time those 3 episodes came out, I already had the first family member inboxing me, which was Nikki McCown's sister, asking me, could I cover her sister's story? Wow. And I was like, wait a minute.
Wow.
I never thought that now I was going to start getting family members of missing women reaching out to me, asking me to cover their stories. And the Nikki McCown case was a case that was really, is actually a pretty more well-known case of a missing Black woman. Crime Junkies covered it on their podcast on one of their very first shows. It's been on the ID channel Disappeared show. It's been covered by Crime Watch. So it's been covered, but it's been 20 years and they're still, just as desperate as they were the day she went missing. And so when that happened, it started to kind of change what the purpose of the show was. I started to think, okay, this show actually can serve a bigger purpose. I can be telling the stories of, Black women who are missing and murdered, but I can actually make an impact, because the reality is that people are not telling these stories, and these families are desperate for someone to listen to them. They don't get the media attention. The police are not, responding to them the way they need to. And they just want somebody to listen. Even if 100 people hear it, that's 100 more people than heard it than they did yesterday. And then it just grew from there. The next family member was a friend of Jennifer Blackman, who's been missing since December of 2020. They reached out to me and asked me to cover her story. And at that point, Jennifer had only been missing for about 4 months. Now it's been over a year, and, they still have no answers. They don't know what, where Jennifer is. So, so like I said, it just kind of went from there. And now it's just a part of, what I do. I'm constantly getting messages in my inbox. I have a really hard time kind of keeping up with the emails almost constantly of people saying, hey, can you cover this story?
It's such a big responsibility,
It is.
How do you protect your own sense of, I don't know if boundaries is the right word, but how do you turn it off? Do you need to step away sometimes? What are you practicing in your own self-care to kind of be able to keep doing the work?
It's interesting. I think that I have been able to attach myself more to the women versus what happened to the women. You know what I mean? I don't focus on the fact that these women, what the gruesome crimes that took their life, or the fact that they're been missing for all of these years. I try to connect with just who these women are, their families, the similarities in our lives, the parallels in our lives, especially women that, are from the city that I'm from, or came from the city I'm from. I think that kind of helps me to not focus too much on the terrible things that happen to you. It is important, but it can't be the focus, you know what I mean? Because it would wear me down. And there are some stories that are hard to tell. I also think the way in which I tell the stories helps as well, because I don't get into graphic details of the crime. I'm not going to repeat every detail that their throat were slashed. And I try not to do that. So I think that also helps me, because I'm not writing that, you know what I mean? I did the story of Mary Turner for my Patreon, and what happened to her, that was really the worst story I have ever read. I knew that I was not going to be able to repeat those words on the podcast. So, I let people know, I'll put a link in there if you really want to know the exact details of what happened, but I can't say the words out of my mouth. So
wow. Yeah. I respect that so much. I mean, I hate to say it, but I think this is changing within the genre, but a while ago, like that is what true crime podcasting was. You know, people wanted to hear those gory details, and the fact that there's a trend moving away from that. And what I hear in your episodes is a real retelling of someone's story. But you mentioned 3 names while you were talking that I'm, you know, horrified to say I don't know these women's story. And we've brought up the discrepancy in media coverage. I think about this all the time, and I want your opinion. Which do you think came first? Does the media project and put out what they think we want to, who we care about most, or are they responding to what they know to be our values, which is this overemphasis, and we assign a lot more value to certain victims or missing people or murdered people than others? Do you think one came first? I know they're feeding off each other. I'm so curious, which do you think was the origin?
Well, I think that it has shifted. I think that pre-internet, pre-social media, I think that, I think the media was putting out what they believed that we cared about, that they didn't believe that people cared about missing and murdered Black women, and therefore they weren't going to put them on the nightly news, or they weren't going to talk about them on the morning shows. But they did care about the beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed white woman who went missing, or whose husband is suspected of murdering her. America cares about that. And so I do think that, you know, when we're talking about even Lacey Peterson time, Natalie Holloway, I think during those eras of when those women went missing and the media was focused on them, I do think that the media, that's what we cared about. I think now, I think social media drives so much of what the media now cares about. I think that, you know, I watch CNN a lot, and they follow, they're talking about what's going on Twitter. They're talking about what's trending. They're talking about who tweeted what and what Facebook posted. So they are very focused on what people are talking about on social media. When I first heard about Gabby Petito, which has been she's been part of kind of the latest conversation about, you know, the missing white woman syndrome. But when I first heard about Gabby Petito, I did not hear about Gabby Petito on the news. I heard about Gabby Petito on social media. And I had been hearing about Gabby Petito for days, if not weeks, before I ever saw the national media pick up her story. So I fully believe that the kind of grassroots effort, you know, that was taking place on Twitter and TikTok and all over, that was having people millions of tweets about what was going on, is why the media eventually did grab onto the Gabby Petito story. I think that people, you know, were like, well, why did the media pick up this story? I think that the media had a hard time ignoring what was going on with Gabby Petito because it was all over the internet. So it would kind of been odd for them to ignore it because everybody was talking about it. So you can't, in this instant, I don't really necessarily blame CNN for picking up the story, but I think that should let everybody know how important it is for people to care. We can't just start pointing our finger at CNN and be like, why don't you pick up this story, when nobody's even talking about it on Twitter. Nobody's talking about it on TikTok. Nobody's talking about it on Instagram. And the media, and especially TV media, they're about ratings. And we do know that, you know what I mean?
Yes.
You know.
So is that what you're seeing with the families that you're dealing with? It sounds like, you know, in the most recent case, I'm thinking of Lauren Smith Fields from Connecticut. It sounds like they're trying to turn to TikTok and to other places to get some energy and movement around her case. Are you familiar with that case, and can you speak to it at all?
Yeah, I am familiar with the case. I think that what has happened, even in the social media world around Lauren Smith, is that's my prime example. There has been a whole kind of uprising on TikTok and amongst, you know, social media users about what happened to her and what's going on with the investigation and the suspicious nature around how she died.
Here's an example of the videos Amara is talking about. This was pulled right from TikTok. I'll link to it in the show notes so you can see the original creator and source. After this clip, we'll take a quick break and be right back.
This is important. If you're seeing this, don't stop fucking watching.
Hi guys, welcome back to my channel.
That was 23-year-old Lauren Smith Field, who on December 12th was found unresponsive in her fucking apartment. I've been taking a break about talking about heavier things like this, but it's the lack of coverage this case is getting that is enraging me. There is very limited news coverage. This is the only article I have been able to find discussing this.
And says the medical examiner has not yet released the cause of death, and investigators aren't commenting.
Without a doubt, we know that my daughter was not a drug user, and I had a second autopsy myself. We paid out of pocket because we felt so uncomfortable with the way it was handled.
It's Lauren.
According to the family, she went on a Bumble date with an older white man whose identity still hasn't been specified. Her father just stated that she wasn't a drug user, and according to the police, this old white man doesn't need to be investigated, even though he's the last person to see her fucking alive. We're almost done with the month and no progress has been made towards Lauren's case. Remember Gabby Petito in this situation. She deserves the same amount of coverage. I haven't been able to find a GoFundMe or anything, but please just spread the word so we can get justice for Lauren. I want to know who the person was she was on a date with, and I want his face plastered everywhere. Protect Black women. Justice for Lauren Smith Fields.
Hey everyone, Rebekah here. It's that time again. We are gearing up for CrimeCon 2022. This year, the event will be held in Las Vegas, and the dates are April 29th to May 1st. I am already hard at work prepping my table for Podcast Row, and I'm involved in a couple of other exciting aspects of the event, and I really hope to see you there. Now, if you use the code DIALOGUE, that's DIE-ALOGUE, you'll get 10% off your regular standard pass. So go to crimecon.com to register, and again, use this code DIALOGUE, DIE-ALOGUE, for 10% off your pass. I hope to see you in Vegas. Hey listeners, I want to introduce you to Sinisterhood, a true crime comedy podcast that covers all things creepy and gives you the deep dives and thorough research I know you guys want. Best friends and longtime comedians Christy Wallace and Heather McKinney covered things like serial killers, disappearances, cults, and cryptids. They even do legal deep dives with Heather, a real-life lawyer, like their recent episodes on the wrongful conviction of Ryan Ferguson, a contestant on this season of The Amazing Race. While you're listening, make sure to subscribe to Sinisterhood via the link in the episode description on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also go to sinisterhood.com for more information.
And that's what we need, you know what I mean? And I think that it's important. Like, we can't do it for every single person. And that's just because there are thousands of people that are going missing. There are thousands of Black women, thousands of women of color are going missing every year. So the likelihood that we would be able to give that much energy to every single one of them, that's not a realistic expectation. But I think that the balance in the coverage is what people are asking for. If we can do it for this person, then we can do it for that person. And like I said, I think that starts with us caring, sharing, tweeting, not just like, oh, that's sad and scrolling past it, but giving it the same energy that we were giving, these other cases.
Yeah, and I think that's one way to fight against the overwhelm. I mean, there are so many cases, and it's just like we'll never achieve equality across. I mean, every victim deserves all the attention and media coverage, and it's impossible. But yeah, the balance is the goal, right? But people can't care more about something they don't know about, and so that is kind of the empowering part of social media. But I still find it so imbalanced, and just what goes viral and what doesn't still reveals so much, so there's so much work to do, but
it does. And I think that's why it's important that there are Black true crime podcasters and there's this, new kind of community, because that's where the change can come. Somebody has to talk about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's hard for somebody maybe with 400 followers to get somebody to latch on to them posting about a missing person. But if you have a podcaster who has 5,000 followers and they're talking about it, that gets it out there. I use my TikTok a lot for that purpose, to try to get, news stories. Even if I just pull a news clip from the local news and post it so that more people are aware, because I have 95,000 TikTok followers. So that means that, the TikTok has kind of exploded. But, so that means that I can get a video to get 30,000 views, and people that are even from the city where I'm pulling the news clip are like, haven't heard about this. Nobody's talking about this.
Wow.
And so, and it makes them angry. It starts to make people mad. And I think that that's also part of it. I think people have to be confronted also with how many of these women are going missing and how you live in this city and you don't even know this. How does that make you feel? You know what I mean? I think that the focus on building the community around pushing these stories and making these stories go viral is what is important. I think that, the media knows what's going on. The media talks about missing white woman syndrome. They understand that they're not covering the stories in an equal way, and then they don't cover the stories in an equal way. And so I think that we have the power to kind of do it ourselves and not rely on the mainstream media. I think that the power of social media, the power of, true crime podcasts can become, the voice for these families, and we can elevate these stories. And like I said in one of my past shows, I believe that just like everything else, once the media sees kind of what is happening without them, they will start to try to figure out how to be a part of it. You know what I mean? Like they feel like they're getting left in the dust. They're going to be like, oh, well, I guess this is what we need to be focusing on and trying to be a part of, because this is what people are caring about. So I think it just starts with us. I think that realizing that all of these women are, somebody's daughter, somebody's mother, sister, friend, they have stories, their lives mattered. And, just listen to it like you listen to any other show and realize that, they're bigger than their deaths, their murders.
Among the cases you've covered so far, and I know every woman in the world and women we're speaking of are as different from each other as, we're as diverse as is. But are there any through lines in the true crime cases that you have covered on Black Girl Gone?
They all come from very diverse backgrounds in terms of, some of them are mothers, some of them are young women. But in terms of some of the things that I've noticed as a kind of theme in the beginning of their investigations is that almost every single one, if there is a missing, talking about missing person cases, the response from the police is always pretty much the same. And then the weeks immediately following ththese women going missing are always pretty much the same. The family reports the woman missing, initially the police will tell them, oh, well, we can't take the report, or sometimes they can take the report, but there's no immediate investigations that begin. And then what happens is that in 9 times out of 10, these families are then left in the very early critical days after their loved one gone missing of being their own investigators. So they're having to do their own searches. They're having to put out their own missing person flyers. They're having to turn to social media, and the police are not getting involved. And sometimes it takes, you'll see, a month after they went missing, the police then started joining in on the searches. That's pretty common amongst almost all of the cases. There's odd things that happen within the investigations or within the information that they release about. And I'm very cautious because, one, I am playing, armchair detective. I'm not privy to case files in a lot of these situations or interviews or the in-depth work that the police may be doing. So I had to be careful to be like, well, they didn't do this, and maybe they did. They just maybe not have told us that they have done it. And I think, that's something that I have to, remember when I'm doing these stories. But I feel like there's critical information about a lot of these missing Black women stories that the police do not release that you would think would be critical to finding these people, or, you know what I mean? Like that you say, like, well, how could that really jeopardize the investigation if you're saying the last place you saw the car was such and such and so and so? Like, why wouldn't you ever release that information on day one? Like, why did you hold that information? The example that comes up to me is the Kiara Coles investigation. Kiara Coles disappeared from Chicago in 2018. She was 3 months pregnant. She was a postal worker. And there was a video surveillance footage of a woman in a postal uniform walking down the street. And pretty much from, the beginning of when Kiara went missing, they were saying that this was the last images of Kiara Coles. It was everywhere. Well, when I did my show, I found out that The video was not Kira Cole's. It never, they knew it wasn't Kira Cole's from the beginning because her mother saw the video and said, that's not my daughter. She's too big. My daughter doesn't walk like that. And instead of stopping to release that false information, the police asked her not to say anything. They told her, don't say anything. And they continued to use this video as if it was Kira. You know, that's a really kind of unique situation. I still to this day can't figure out why they asked the mother to not tell anybody that wasn't Kira. But it's just little things like that. And because I am a true crime junkie and I am a true crime connoisseur, that I've seen happen time and time again in cases that are not Black women, that are not people of color. So, you know.
And do you think there's just sometimes that they do these things, like tell the mother not to say anything because they can, because nobody's watching in the same way?
Oh, yeah. I think that that's part of it. I said I had this theory, and it's like, I cannot prove it, but I had this theory that the reason why the police in these particular cases don't want to release certain information is because they don't want that type of pressure put on them to solve these cases.
Sure.
Like, I think that they're like, well, if we tell people this, then we're going to get 1,000 calls from people saying, well, we've seen this. And it just like, because what else would be the reason why you guys are not releasing as much? And this person is missing, you know what I mean? It's one thing if it's a murder investigation and you are narrowing in on a suspect, but you're telling me that this person's been missing. You have no idea what happened to them, yet you have critical information that you will not release to the public. But then they come out and say, well, we're asking for the public's help. We'll tell the public something. What are we helping you with? Like, give us something, like, you know, so yeah.
Yeah, that's worth it. You know, like the missing person's life is worth the manpower. Wow.
I think that the focus on building the community around pushing these stories and making these stories go viral is what is important. I think that, you know, the media knows what's going on. The media talks about missing white woman syndrome. They understand that they're not covering the stories in an equal way, and then they don't cover the stories in an equal way. And so I think that we have the power to kind of do it ourselves and not rely on the mainstream media. I think that the power of social media, the power of, you know, true crime podcasts can become, you know, the voice for these families, and we can elevate these stories. And like I said in one of my past shows, I believe that just like everything else, once the media sees kind of what is happening without them, they will start to try to figure out how to be a part of it. You know what I mean? Like, they feel like they're getting left in the dust. They're going to be like, oh, well, I guess this is what we need to be focusing on and trying to be a part of, because this is what people are caring about. So, yeah, so I think it just starts with us. I think that realizing that all of these women are, you know, somebody's daughter, somebody's mother, sister, friend. They have stories. Their lives mattered. And, you know, just listen to it like you listen to any other show and realize that, you know, they're bigger than their deaths, their murders. I think that it's important that, you know, we keep having this conversation and not reactionary either. I love the fact that we're continuing the conversation, and it's not because something has just happened. We're just continuing to acknowledge that this is something that we need to keep talking about. And the more we keep talking about it, the better chances we have of changing, you know, the outcomes. And it's also not fair to the victims of the crime. I mean, even in the Gabby Petito case, she didn't ask to be part of these conversations. And I think that, you know, hats off to Gabby's father, because I follow him on Twitter. And even in the wake of his tragedy, I've seen that he's been trying to share and bring attention to cases of missing people of color and Black people. And very much like, you know, George Floyd didn't ask to be the poster child for this new civil rights movement or those protests that happened in 2020. Gabby didn't ask to be the poster child for missing white women syndrome, but in what happened to them, I think a lot of conversations have started and a lot of people are acknowledging flaws in the system. But like I said, I'm glad that we're continuing to have these conversations.
Yes, agreed. Beautifully said. Amara, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for having this conversation. And thank you for having this conversation. And thank you for having this conversation. And thank you.
Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production, audio engineered by Jason Usry and produced, hosted, and edited by me, Rebekah Sebastian. If you love the podcast, please consider becoming a diehard by signing up at patreon.com/dialogue. Other ways to support the show, follow along on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across platforms, and you can now watch most episodes on YouTube by subscribing to my channel, Rebekah Sebastian. For more information or to drop me a note, visit RebekahSebastian.com. Until next time, thank you for listening and killing the small talk.